Yes, what we are going to do is turn around from the beach. We've been standing on the beach looking out to sea, and now we're going to turn around and look up the river basin. I hope that what I'm going to present will be quite complementary to what we've heard from the Rhodes University colleagues. In two senses. One is that we're going to shift our emphasis from marine to freshwater, but also what I want to do is present to you some of the synthesis of that we've done and gone through within IUCN based upon a body of work that I'll show you. Some synthesis to help us simplify and make sense of what's an ecosystem approach. And I say that because I came 6 or 7 years ago into the job I'm in, and we had a program which I'll show you called the Water and Nature Initiative, and one of its overall goal was to mainstream an ecosystem approach for integrated water resource management. And I probably spent 3 years trying to figure out what on earth an ecosystem approach was. Even though we were doing projects that were doing interesting and good things. So what I will eventually get to is what I found to be helpful in making sense of what an ecosystem approach is, and we'll see how that helps us in this workshop. The presentation I'll give has 3 parts, and I will do my best to stop at the end of each section to allow any questions, and perhaps we can have a discussion at that point in time about any issues that are coming up. But the first part, and what I want to do, is look at principles of watershed services. Obviously these are linked to ecosystem services, and some examples of how to put them to use in an ecosystem approach, and start to get a really practical picture based upon some practical experience of the ecosystem approach in action. Then in the second part I'll show just a couple of slides about this idea of synthesis to make the ecosystem approach practical, and I do that through a set of 7 questions. So there's a lot of simplification. We've talked this morning about, or up to now, about a lot of very complex issues, and what I will do is present a very simplified perspective on that is not an attempt to say that complexity needs to be ignored, not at all. Underneath that, all that complexity has to be dealt with. Then in the third part, I will turn my attention to valuation and explore a little bit about how valuation of ecosystem services, of watershed services, helps with the ecosystem approach. And I want to propose to you, or reintroduce to those of you who already have looked at this, propose to you the idea of natural infrastructure. Natural infrastructure for watersheds, for river basins, as a basis for a common frame of analysis for investment in water resource management. And talk about how that common frame of reference can help us make investments that are aligned to the ecosystem approach. There we go. Okay, so just to begin with, then, this set of photographs on the screen captures the idea of watershed services. So we're talking with watershed services, of course, about water-related ecosystem services and how it is that healthy watersheds that are functioning well, how they help us to sustain human well-being, to sustain economies, and so on. This is drawn, of course, from frameworks for ecosystem services. So we have the way wetlands relate to regulation of flow and storage of water, purification and filtering of water. Watersheds and their function are the ultimate source of water for food production. So we need to link the way we manage watersheds to supply of water for food, and so on. Fisheries production and important services like getting water from one place to another in the river basin, rivers and healthy river systems, water courses that are not degraded, help us do that and help us do it for free. Watersheds and good watershed functioning provides the water for hydropower, which is a major economic activity. We have to take great care then to not overlook the services that watersheds provide. We had mentioned just now, I don't know if it was in this context, but the idea of a water, food and energy nexus, which in the water world at least has been a great topic of conversation for about the last year. And it's based upon trying to get to grips with the idea that the water security for people and the economy is interrelated very closely with food and energy security for people and the economy. And when this framework was first proposed, in the diagram that you see at the center of the slide, in that central circle it just said available water resources. So we said, no, that's wrong, because that water has to come from somewhere. So we said at the center of that idea of available water resources that underpins these securities, you have to have ecosystem functions, ecosystem services that ensure the sustained supply of adequate quantities of water and clean water. And so we can bring to bear watershed services into managing and building water, food and energy security. That is, unless we overlook them and leave them out. I must be just out of range. There we go. So on that basis, one of the things that intrigues me about and is a basis for a lot of the strategies that we're working with in IUCN in water is how do you bring ecosystem services, how do you bring watershed services into the solution sets for water resource management? So it's too easy to say the solutions to water resource management lies in building some more storage or in developing a dam or water filtration plants, etc. So how do you bring ecosystems into the solution set? And I see that as a fundamental question that we're trying to get at with the ecosystem approach. So on the left of this slide, you see the common definition of integrated water resource management. And the major point I want to make here is right at the end. So the definition says we're going to manage water in a coordinated way, and we're going to maximize benefits, and we're going to do that without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. And I think that kind of formulation leads to two choices, which you see in the boxes on the right. That can lead you to consider nature as a constraint. So we're undertaking development, but we have to be concerned about protecting nature. So it becomes a constraint on what we can do. And that leads to, therefore, arguments between economic decision makers and conservation decision makers about what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. I think the bottom box is much more about what we're trying to work with the ecosystem approach. It says that nature's not a constraint, nature is a toolbox for solving these problems. It's a toolbox that brings to bear a set of services that help us solve water resource management problems. So there's a set of services, a set of solutions, provides a starting point for getting to grips with water resource management. So we don't, as they did in the water, food, energy nexus diagram, you don't begin by overlooking ecosystems and then try and fix it later. So with the ecosystem approach, and this goes back to the first presentation we heard this morning, there's a set of definitions attached to that from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in our trying to figure out, well, what does this really mean practically, I think we have to think about what the ecosystem approach tells us in terms of, as you see at the top of the slide, what is it that you do? So you work on maintaining and restoring ecosystems, functions and services, providing that toolbox for helping you solve things. But critically, it's also about how you do it. So it's not just about using ecosystems, it's about how you do it. And the points there are some paraphrase from that definition from the CBD. So how you do it has to be related to, or needs to be related to, equity and identifying benefits that you can share from these services and then sharing them equitably. Being very adaptive. To make this work, you have to have management systems that are flexible and adaptive and enable innovation and enable learning. You need to, there's a principle of decentralization. So all decisions about how you're working with water resource management can't be made at the center. They need to be made by the people that are best placed to take them on the best available evidence and then best placed to implement them. And that happens at a set of different levels. It's not all about putting it down at community level. It's not all about putting it in a river basin organization. It's about working at a set of levels. This idea of intersectoral, interdisciplinary cooperation, something we've talked about a lot already. And the final point there, I think, is in our experience, is really fundamental, and it relates back also to this point that's been raised about dealing with uncertainties. We don't have perfect evidence, we don't have perfect information, and we never will have perfect evidence or information. So part of implementing the ecosystem approach, and the reason that we do it in these ways, is to create platforms for negotiation. So bringing together stakeholders to have a shared understanding of the issues, shared understanding of the evidence, and try to come to some common sets of ways forward. So I want to just explore with you then one example taken from the portfolio of work that IUCN's done over the last 10 years from the IUCN Water and Nature Initiative. And this one example, just to illustrate some of these concepts and points. So this example is taken from the Komadugu-Yobe River Basin, which is one of the rivers that drains into Lake Chad. So it's draining from the northern, roughly the northern 25% of Nigeria. It's a place that's been under a lot of pressure from resource degradation, from population growth, from poverty. It has been somewhere where there's been a number of water infrastructure investments made that have included building dams and building irrigation projects that have not fulfilled their goals. They have not met the development goals that were set for them. And in fact, they've led to, because of changes in the flow of the river, they've led to quite considerable impacts and degradation downstream that have left people less well off, that have left people less food secure, that have left people more vulnerable than they were without them. And part of that, a significant part of that, is related to the degradation of the ecosystem in terms of weed infestation, in terms of erosion of the watercourse itself, but is linked to social processes, social issues to do with conflict, and governance issues to do with institutions and really the paralysis of institutions in the context, as was the case in the context of Nigeria, where you had state governments, you had local institutions, state governments, and the federal government not being able to work properly together to solve this issue. Okay, so in terms of going back to the idea of watershed services, in terms of the watershed services that in the Komadugu-Yobe had been lost over the 60s, 70s, 80s, the idea of the river as a conveyance system for water was lost as the watercourse itself was degraded. The availability of water for irrigation downstream through flood recession irrigation was lost because the dams stopped the natural cycle of flooding, and therefore the dispersal of nutrients and sediments through the basin was degraded. The productivity of fisheries in the basin was severely degraded, and the watershed service provided by the natural ecosystem for controlling these typha weeds was lost, so that they infested. You see them in the background of the picture there. They blocked the watercourse. They choked up the wetlands. So, and the change in flows in the river meant that the people downstream, it was more difficult to manage the risks of flood, and more difficult because they became very unpredictable. It became more difficult to manage the risks of drought. And the bottom point there is also key, that people's heritage and their identity and their cultures tied up with fisheries and farming and livestock herding were themselves also lost, which was a source of part of the conflict that we saw that was common in the basin. So the actions that were taken through this project, this is a project that started around about 2004, and the activities that I'm describing here, they worked through till about 2009. So the first activity was, or not the first, one of the keystones of the activity of the project was gathering together information. So having an understanding that could be shared amongst all stakeholders about what was the real situation with water and natural resources and the conflicts around natural resources and the impacts of the dams on the livelihoods and so on. The second point, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, was a process of building consensus around a catchment management plan. And the catchment management plan, which I'll outline in just one second, but the catchment management plan in itself is a useful roadmap. But what's really valuable here, and this goes back to the point about how we do this, what's really valuable here is the consensus building process. So you had a process of building this plan. The plan is of some value, but the process is really key because it brought together stakeholders to understand, work together, figure out what are the options for trying to get to grips with these problems. And so out of that came the genesis of institutional reforms that have led to some really interesting outcomes. The third point there is about how to do implementation actions. Implementation. So by that I mean moving from a mindset of planning to a mindset of how do we make things actually change on the ground. In our experience, that has to be linked. There has to be a link between the planning processes and a parallel process of doing pilot projects that get concrete results on the ground and that feed those lessons into the planning process and build confidence in the planning process as being something worth following through on. And so in this case, those kinds of pilot projects related to restoration of fish habitat, restoration of flows in the river, resolving conflicts as a very practical undertaking, and working with people's livelihoods. And the fourth point is about governance. And again, another keystone of this whole process. So getting governance right, and this is in the case, in the context, as I said, of real institutional paralysis. So this process of working with stakeholders, so the community level actors dealing with fisheries, food and livelihoods, livestock and so on, the operators of the infrastructure, dams. The city of Kano is in the basin too, so the municipal water users, the state governments. There's 6 Nigerian states working in this, sharing this basin, and the federal government coming together to rethink how they organize the institutions, and to do that in a way that is transparent and accountable. And one of the keys then was to what they called a water charter. So almost like a constitution for the management and development of the water resources in the basin, which set out who was responsible for what, what the various rights were, and what the various roles were of different actors. And finally, the final point there, and we'll come back to this. This is a big topic for the week, of course, is that set of actions and the renewed confidence, the understanding that management actions could be effective, that governance could be done in a way that was improved equity, that enabled people to take action. The confidence that created was sufficient that the governments involved, the state government and the federal government, put money together, invested together into a trust fund for implementation of the management plan. So the investment mechanism that resulted from this was then therefore intricately tied up to, achieving that was intricately tied up to the process of getting there and the elements that came together. So just to finish this section of the session with a couple of points about this catchment management plan. And remember I said that in looking at the ecosystem approach, we have to be aware of both what you should do and the means and how you do it. So what you see listed are these 8 points are in fact the 8 strategic priorities that they listed in the plan. And underneath this, of course, were many, many different types of actions. But these were the 8 headline items. So as an example of moving the ecosystem approach from theory into practice, this is a bit of a roadmap for doing that, and it lays itself out into these 2 sections. So at the top, it's about what you do. It's about working with conservation. It's about normalizing flows in the river, what you do to maintain and restore the ecosystem functions and services. And the second 4 points are about how you therefore do it. This idea of more participatory governance, creating negotiation platforms, decentralizing decision making, having governance that works at multiple levels. And as I say, this package of actions and processes around it is what then mobilized significant new investment into implementing the ecosystem approach. This next section, in fact, just has 2 slides. This first slide just gives you a global overview of this IUCN initiative that ran from 2001 until early 2012, called the Water and Nature Initiative, which was working in its first phase, which ran to 2009, was working in a set of river basins in the regions of the world that you see marked in gray on the map, asking the question, how do you go about implementing integrated water resource management, integrated river basin management using the ecosystem approach? And out of that came a set of results in which things went well in some places and we achieved some certain level of progress, and in other places things didn't go well, and there was a set of lessons attached to that. And then in the second phase, which we've just completed, was much more focused on how do you scale up from learning at basin level about implementation to national rollout, national and regional initiatives. So the point I want to get to is simply that out of that body of work, we have a whole mountain of examples of how to pull things together, what works and what doesn't work. And as I said to you when I started speaking, I said, when I first encountered the ecosystem approach, I spent some considerable time saying, well, what on earth is this really? So the next slide from this body of work is so all the blame for it probably rests with me. It's my interpretation practically about how we use the ecosystem approach. So I put it in the title about how you move from ecosystem approach to an action plan. And so we break this down into 7 questions. So I'm imagining myself sitting around a table with some of these stakeholders, and we're trying to ask the question, how are we going to fix the pressures on this basin? So the first question is, of course, well, what is the problem? What is the real problems that we have to get to grips with? And that's going to be, as I said, this hides a lot of complexity. So there'll be a lot of issues attached to that. What is the problem? But to identify what is the problem, we have to have good information, and we have to analyze it and share that information. The second question is, what ecosystem service, what services do we need to solve a certain problem? So if a downstream wetland is drying out and the fishery that local communities rely upon is being degraded, what are the services that we need to bring to bear to help solve that problem? And those services can comprise technologies, they can comprise infrastructure that we would build, or they can provide ecosystem services. Remember I said in the ecosystem approach, let's think about nature, at least on one hand, nature as a set of tools with which we can try and address certain sets of problems. The third question then is, what are the actions that we need to take on the ground? So what really has to change? So if you have a dam which is impounding water, which means that downstream ecosystem functions are degraded, and fisheries are degraded downstream. What do you actually have to do to change that? You have to change the way the dam is managed to enable, for example, synthetic floods downstream. So what do you actually have to do on the ground? And then the fourth question is, what governance do you need to enable action? And this gets back to some of the discussion we just had. So what policies, what laws, what institutions, what compliance and enforcement is needed to enable action to happen? It's needed to enable the right people to make the right kinds of decisions at the right time. And the fifth question then relates back also to the governance question and to the point about the roles of communities. So who needs to be empowered to act? So who actually has to take the sets of actions? And that's so the critical thing here is that if you are calling upon if you're calling upon a dam operator to change the way calling upon a dam operator to change the way a dam is managed, the flows from a dam are managed, then he or she has to be empowered through the decision-making system in the basin to do that. And you can have a set of issues around communities that they have to be able to take the actions that are needed. The sixth point is, what knowledge and capacities do you need to take these actions? So, an example we'll get back to is what might be, how might knowledge of values of ecosystems help, for example? What kinds of capacities do people need to do things differently? And the seventh question is, what incentives and what financing do you need to put this into place? So, these are my 7 questions about how you can think about, in a practical sense, what is a means of building an action plan based upon the ecosystem approach. So as I said, a lot of complexity under there, but our point is, based upon the learning from this body of work, is that we need to pull together packages of interventions, packages of reforms, packages of actions, and we need to have a balance across those 7 questions in order to move things forward. So I'm interested in what people think about that as a practical, simple, more simplified way of trying to get your head around how can we use the ecosystem approach. Okay, so what I wanted to do in the minutes remaining is to look at how one set of thoughts about how ecosystem valuation can help with this ecosystem approach. And I want to propose, to help us do that, this idea, the concept of nature as infrastructure. So understanding that nature and ecosystems provide a set of functions to society that are parallel to the kinds of functions that you're obtaining when you build infrastructure. And just to emphasize, which I will do a number of times as I show you these slides, what we're talking about here is not, let's not do building infrastructure and instead just rely on nature. That's not the point we're making. The point is, if you can bring these together into combinations, into packages of built and natural infrastructure, then we will have some outcomes for the ecosystem approach. So in the table you see here, there's a column on the left. There's a column on the left which is says facility, but what we're getting at there is the kinds of functions you're after. So water storage, water conveyance, regulation of floods, filtration of water, etc. And we all know that there's a set of built infrastructure that we would invest in and build to achieve those kinds of facilities, so reservoirs and canals to move water around, and levees and dams to control floods, and filtration plants to clean up water, etc. And at the bottom on the coastal side too. But there's also a set of ecosystems also provide some of those, also provide the same sorts of functions. So storage, water storage is provided by upland soils. So if you lose upland soils through erosion, you lose that function. Water storage is provided by lakes, by groundwater, etc. Conveyance, getting water from one place to another, provided by rivers. Flood regulations provided by floodplains and wetlands, and so on. So, part of the key point here, so the empty columns on the right, is if we're going to be able to make comparisons, if we're going to help decision makers to make comparisons about whether to use an investment in built infrastructure or an investment in natural infrastructure, we need to be able to help them do that on the same basis. So if we can take the concept of natural infrastructure and start to put values on it through ecosystem valuation, then decision makers, financing institutions, etc., can start weighing up better the costs and benefits of different choices between natural infrastructure and built infrastructure, and then start making investments. And what we really want to do, and we'll get to this, is to have people start thinking through how do we invest in combinations of built and natural infrastructure, because out of that we get a broader set of impacts and results. So you see a definition here which is roughly taken from a dictionary, which says that infrastructure is the stock of facilities, services, and installations that are needed for the functioning of a society and economy. So we're calling nature and the services it provides as part of the infrastructure complement that a country has and has to work with as it develops. So the stock of facilities and services and so on that a country has to base its development around is encompassing, yes, both built infrastructure, things you build, and the natural capital assets that it has. So thinking about natural infrastructure in terms of natural infrastructure is an opportunity to start thinking really differently about nature. At the start of this session I said one of the advantages that we want to, one of the things that we want to try and promote through the ecosystem approach is to get away from saying you have to choose between going just with nature or destroying nature and building infrastructure. So natural infrastructure is an opportunity to think differently. It's an opportunity to say, okay, this is part of the asset base we have to develop with, and to start therefore investing in it in the same way you would invest in other parts of your asset base. So in one of the first slides I showed, we looked at the water, food, and energy nexus. If we imagine a river basin and think about what's the infrastructure that you will develop within a river basin to help you optimize, so to help you obtain out of your river basin management better water security, better food security, better energy security. There's a set of infrastructure to help you do that. And some of that is about energy, so different energy investments, agriculture, different investments in for example, irrigation schemes, urban water investments, but also at the bottom on the left is investing in the natural infrastructure of the basin, so that you have in developing a river basin, in developing infrastructure in a river basin, you think through what's the combination, what's the portfolio of built infrastructure and natural infrastructure that gives me the best result in terms of the multiple goals that I'm trying to achieve, whether that's for water, food, energy security, or whatever. The multiple goals that you're trying to achieve in development and in river basin management. So then, as we turn our minds from having a framework where we can compare the values of ecosystem services, of natural infrastructure, and built infrastructure. And so understanding that under a common framework there are values to how do we invest in them, we have to just think about what it is that we finance. So when we talk about built infrastructure, as you see on the left, we talk about financing the building and the building of infrastructure, its refurbishment, operations, and the maintenance. And on the natural infrastructure side, we do exactly the same thing. It's just we use different words. We talk about restoring ecosystems, we talk about investing in resource management, we talk about conservation. And but both, on both the built infrastructure side and the natural infrastructure side, require financing, require investments, and require an analysis that says what's the return on investment. So if we can turn our thinking from do we build or do we conserve or do we build, to one in which what's the best combination of built and natural infrastructure, then you can start rethinking the way you do investment. So when we have investments that can combine in packages built and natural infrastructure, we can start asking, how do we deal with multiple objectives? What's the best combination that will help us deal with multiple objectives? What's the best combination of engineering and ecosystems? And critically, the final point there is what do you need to invest in terms of people and in terms of institutions to make it work? And the investment mechanisms for doing that, sure, one of them is payments for ecosystem services. So you have, we'll talk a lot more about this obviously, but you have beneficiaries, you have providers of services and beneficiaries of services. And you can construct deals between the beneficiaries and the providers that give incentives for the providers to continue or to improve the way they manage the resource. And there's different mechanisms for doing that. The example given there is city water funds. So numbers of cities around the world have water funds that they use to invest in the sources of water. But the third point is about if we have packages of built and natural infrastructure, then nature becomes part of the strategic investment we can undertake in a river basin. So then we have investment plans that say we're going to develop an irrigation scheme and a dam, but alongside that we're going to invest in the management, the restoration, the management of the associated wetlands. And out of that comes a better chance of more optimally meeting a wider set of objectives. So the final point here is that when you do make investments in ecosystem services, when you do make investments in natural infrastructure, you do that through the mechanisms of the ecosystem approach that we've been exploring. And that necessarily means that what you invest in nature is qualitatively different from what you invest in terms of major water infrastructure. So major water infrastructure investments may be very top-down, they may be very expert-driven. When you're investing in natural infrastructure, you're investing in yes, ecosystem restoration, yes, different kinds of tools and technologies for managing ecosystems. But you're also critically thinking back to the question about with the ecosystem approach about how you do it. You're also critically making investments in stakeholders and their knowledge and their skills. You're making investments in institutions that enable people to take action, and in processes that build participation and consensus building about what needs. So you're investing in good water governance, and out of that come some important elements alongside development outcomes from major water infrastructure investment, some important elements for social development and equity. So your investments then, based upon your understanding of the values of the costs and benefits of ecosystems and ecosystem services relative to the costs and benefits of built infrastructure, you can start using that as a catalyst for making the investments in mobilizing those 7 questions that we looked at, to start putting implementation of the ecosystem approach in the discussion we've just been having for integrated water resource management alongside and part of, an integral part of the package for water infrastructure development.
Yes, I need a